African Americans, one of the largest of the many ethnic groups in the United States. African Americans are mainly of African ancestry, but many have non-black ancestors as well. African Americans are largely the descendants of enslaved people who were brought from their African homelands by force to work in the New World. Their rights were severely limited, and they were long denied a rightful share in the economic, social, and political progress of the United States. Nevertheless, African Americans have made basic and lasting contributions to American history and culture. At the turn of the 21st century, more than half the country's more than 36 million African Americans lived in the South. 10 southern states had black populations exceeding 1 million. African Americans were also concentrated in the largest cities, with more than 2 million living in New York City and more than 1 million in Chicago. Detroit, Philadelphia, and Houston each had a black population between 500,000 and 1 million. As Americans of African descent reached each new plateau in their struggle for equality, they reevaluated their identity. The slaveholder labels of black and Negro, Spanish for black, were offensive, so they chose the euphemism colored when they were freed. Capitalized, Negro became acceptable during the migration to the North for factory jobs. Afro-American was adopted by civil rights activists to underline pride in their ancestral homeland, but black, the symbol of power and revolution, proved more popular. All these terms are still reflected in the names of dozens of organizations. To re-establish cultural integrity, in the late 1980s, Jesse Jackson proposed African American, which, unlike some baseless color label, proclaims kinship with a historical land base. In the 21st century, the terms black and African American both were widely used. Africans assisted the Spanish and the Portuguese during their early exploration of the Americas. In the 16th century, some black explorers settled in the Mississippi Valley and in the areas that became South Carolina and New Mexico. The most celebrated black explorer of the Americas was Esteban, who traveled through the Southwest in the 1530s. The uninterrupted history of black people in the United States began in 1619, when 20 Africans were landed in the English colony of Virginia. These individuals were not enslaved people but indentured servants, persons bound to an employer for a limited number of years, as were many of the settlers of European descent whites. By the 1660s, large numbers of Africans were being brought to the English colonies. In 1790, black people numbered almost 760,000 and made up nearly 1/5 of the population of the United States. Attempts to hold black servants beyond the normal term of indenture culminated in the legal establishment of black chattel slavery in Virginia in 1661 and in all the English colonies by 1750. Black people were easily distinguished by their skin color, the result of evolutionary pressures favoring the presence in the skin of a dark pigment called melanin in populations in equatorial climates, from the rest of the populace, making them highly visible targets for enslavement. Moreover, the development of the belief that they were an inferior race with a heathen culture made it easier for whites to rationalize the enslavement of black people. Enslaved Africans were put to work clearing and cultivating the farmlands of the New World. Of an estimated 10 million Africans brought to the Americas by the trade of enslaved peoples, about 430,000 came to the territory of what is now the United States. The overwhelming majority were taken from the area of Western Africa stretching from present-day Senegal to Angola, where political and social organization as well as art, music, and dance were highly advanced. On or near the African coast had emerged the major kingdoms of Oyo, Ashanti, Benin, Dahomey, and the Congo. In the Sudanese interior had arisen the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, the Hausa states, and the states of Kanem-Bornu. Such African cities as Djenné and Timbuktu, both now in Mali, were at one time major commercial and educational centers. With the increasing profitability of slavery and the trade of enslaved peoples, some Africans themselves sold captives to the European traders. The captured Africans were generally marched in chains to the coast and crowded into the holds of slave ships for the dreaded Middle Passage across the Atlantic Ocean, usually to the West Indies. Shock, disease, and suicide were responsible for the deaths of at least 1/6 during the crossing. In the West Indies, the survivors were seasoned, taught the rudiments of English, and drilled in the routines and discipline of plantation life. Enslaved people played a major, though unwilling and generally unrewarded, role in laying the economic foundations of the United States, especially in the South. Black people also played a leading role in the development of Southern speech, folklore, music, dancing, and food, blending the cultural traits of their African homelands with those of Europe. During the 17th and 18th centuries, enslaved Africans and African Americans, those born in the New World, worked mainly on the tobacco, rice, and indigo plantations of the southern seaboard. Eventually slavery became rooted in the South's huge cotton and sugar plantations. Although northern businessmen made great fortunes from the trade of enslaved peoples and from investments in southern plantations, slavery was never widespread in the North. Crispus Attucks, a formerly enslaved sailor killed in the Boston Massacre of 1770, was the first martyr to the cause of American independence from Great Britain. During the American Revolution, some 5,000 black soldiers and sailors fought on the American side. After the Revolution, some enslaved people, particularly former soldiers, were freed, and the northern states abolished slavery. But with the ratification of the Constitution of the United States, in 1788, slavery became more firmly entrenched than ever in the South. The Constitution counted an enslaved person as 3/5 of a person for purposes of taxation and representation in Congress, thus increasing the number of representatives from slave states, prohibited Congress from abolishing the African trade of enslaved peoples before 1808, and provided for the return of fugitive enslaved people to their owners. In 1807 U.S. Pres. Thomas Jefferson signed legislation that officially ended the African trade of enslaved peoples beginning in January 1808. However, this act did not presage the end of slavery. Rather, it spurred the growth of the domestic trade of enslaved peoples in the United States, especially as a source of labor for the new cotton lands in the southern interior. Increasingly, the supply of enslaved people came to be supplemented by the practice of slave breeding, in which enslaved women were raped as early as age 13 and forced to give birth as often as possible. Laws known as the slave codes regulated the slave system to promote absolute control by the master and complete submission by the enslaved person. Under these laws, the enslaved person was a chattel, a piece of property and a source of labor that could be bought and sold like an animal. The enslaved person was allowed no stable family life and little privacy. Enslaved people were prohibited by law from learning to read or write. The meek received tokens of favor from the master, and the rebellious provoked brutal punishment. A social hierarchy among enslaved people on plantations also helped keep them divided. At the top were those working in the house, next in rank were the skilled artisans, at the bottom were the vast majority of field hands, who bore the brunt of the harsh plantation life. With this tight control there were few successful slave revolts. Slave plots were invariably betrayed. The revolt led by Cato in Stono, South Carolina, in 1739 took the lives of 30 whites. A slave revolt in New York City in 1741 caused heavy property damage. Some slave revolts, such as those of Gabriel Prosser at Richmond, Virginia, in 1800, and Denmark Vesey Charleston, South Carolina, in 1822, were elaborately planned. The slave revolt that was perhaps most frightening to slave owners was the one led by Nat Turner, Southampton, Virginia, in 1831. Before Turner and his co-conspirators were captured, they had killed about 60 whites. Individual resistance by enslaved people took such forms as mothers killing their newborn children to save them from enslavement, the poisoning of slave owners, the destruction of machinery and crops, arson, malingering, and running away. Thousands of runaway enslaved people were led to freedom in the North and in Canada by black and white abolitionists who organized a network of secret routes and hiding places that came to be known as the Underground Railroad. One of the greatest heroes of the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman, a formerly enslaved woman who on numerous trips to the South helped hundreds of enslaved people escape to freedom. During the period of slavery, free black Americans made up about 1/10 of the entire African American population. In 1860 there were almost 500,000 free African Americans, half in the South and half in the North. The free black population originated with former indentured servants and their descendants. It was augmented by free black immigrants from the West Indies and by black people freed by individual slave owners. But free black Americans were only technically free. In the South, where they posed a threat to the institution of slavery, they suffered both in law and by custom many of the restrictions imposed on the enslaved. In the North, Free black people were discriminated against in such rights as voting, property ownership, and freedom of movement, though they had some access to education and could organize. Free black people also faced the danger of being kidnapped and enslaved. The earliest African American leaders emerged among the free black communities of the North, particularly those of Philadelphia, Boston, and New York City. Free African Americans in the North established their own institutions, churches, schools, and mutual aid societies. One of the first of these organizations was the African Methodist Episcopal Church, AME Church, formed in 1816 and led by Bishop Richard Allen of Philadelphia. Among other noted free African Americans was the astronomer and mathematician Benjamin Banneker. Free black people were among the first abolitionists. They included John B. Russwurm and Samuel E. Cornish, who in 1827 founded Freedom's Journal, the first African American-run newspaper in the United States. Black support also permitted the founding and survival of The Liberator, a journal begun in 1831 by the white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. Probably the most celebrated of all African American journals was the North Star, founded in 1847 by the former enslaved person Frederick Douglass, who argued that the anti-slavery movement must be led by black people. Beginning in 1830, African American leaders began meeting regularly in national and state conventions. But they differed on the best strategies to use in the struggle against slavery and discrimination. Some, such as David Walker and Henry Highland Garnet, called on enslaved people to revolt and overthrow their masters. Others, such as Russwurm and Paul Cuff, proposed that a major modern black country be established in Africa. Supported by the American Colonization Society, whose membership was overwhelmingly white, African Americans founded Liberia in West Africa in 1822. Their ideas foreshadowed the development of Pan-African nationalism under the leadership of AIM Bishop Henry M. Turner a half-century later. However, most black leaders then and later regarded themselves as Americans and thought that the problems of their people could be solved only by a continuing struggle at home. The extension of slavery to new territories had been a subject of national political controversy since the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 prohibited slavery in the area now known as the Midwest. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 began a policy of admitting an equal number of slave and free states into the Union. But the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, both grounded in the doctrine of popular sovereignty along with the U.S. Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision of 1857, opened all the territories to slavery. By the end of the 1850s, the North feared complete control of the country by slaveholding interests, and whites in the South believed that the North was determined to destroy its way of life. White Southerners had been embittered by Northern defiance of the 1850 Federal Fugitive Slave Act and had been alarmed in 1859 by the raid at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now in West Virginia, led by the white abolitionist John Brown. After Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860 on the anti-slavery platform of the new Republican Party, the Southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. The Civil War, which ultimately liberated the country's slaves, began in 1861. But preservation of the Union, not the abolition of slavery, was the initial objective of President Lincoln. He initially believed in gradual emancipation, with the federal government compensating the slaveholders for the loss of their property. But in September 1862 he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people residing in states in rebellion against the United States as of January 1, 1863, were to be free. Thus the Civil War became, in effect, a war to end slavery. African American leaders such as author William Wells Brown, physician and author Martin R. Delany, and Douglass vigorously recruited black men into the Union armed forces. Douglass declared in the North Star, who would be free themselves must strike the blow. By the end of the Civil War more than 186,000 African Americans were in the Union Army. They performed heroically despite discrimination in pay, rations, equipment, and assignments as well as the unrelenting hostility of the Confederate troops. Enslaved people served as a labor force for the Confederacy, but thousands of them dropped their tools and escaped to the Union lines. As a result of the Union victory in the Civil War and the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution 1865, nearly 4 million slaves were freed. The 14th Amendment 1868 granted African Americans citizenship, and the 15th Amendment 1870 guaranteed their right to vote. Yet the Reconstruction period 1865–77 was one of disappointment and frustration for African Americans, for these new provisions of the Constitution were often ignored, particularly in the South. After the Civil War, the freedmen were thrown largely on their own meager resources. Landless and uprooted, they moved about in search of work. They generally lacked adequate food, clothing, and shelter. The Southern states enacted black codes, laws resembling the slave codes that restricted the movement of the formerly enslaved people in an effort to force them to work as plantation laborers, often for their former masters, at absurdly low wages. The Federal Freedmen's Bureau, established by Congress in 1865, assisted the formerly enslaved people by giving them food and finding jobs and homes for them. The Bureau established hospitals and schools, including such institutions of higher learning as Fisk University and Hampton Institute. Northern philanthropic agencies, such as the American Missionary Association, also aided the freedmen. During Reconstruction, African Americans wielded political power. In the South for the first time, their leaders were largely clergymen, lawyers, and teachers who had been educated in the North and abroad. Among the ablest were Robert B. Elliott of South Carolina and John R. Lynch of Mississippi. Both were speakers of their state House of Representatives and were members of the U.S. Congress. Pinckney B.S. Pinchback was elected lieutenant governor of Louisiana and served briefly as the state's acting governor. Jonathan Gibbs served as Florida's Secretary of State and Superintendent of Education. Between 1869 and 1901, 20 African American representatives and 2 African American senators, Hiram R. Revels and Blanche K. Bruce of Mississippi, sat in the U.S. Congress. But black political power was short-lived. Northern politicians grew increasingly conciliatory to the white South, so that by 1872 virtually all leaders of the Confederacy had been pardoned and were again able to vote and hold office. By means of economic pressure and the terrorist activities of violent anti-black groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, most African Americans were kept away from the polls. By 1877, when Pres. Rutherford B. Hayes withdrew the last federal troops from the South, Southern whites were again in full control. African Americans were disfranchised by the provisions of new state constitutions such as those adopted by Mississippi in 1890 and by South Carolina and Louisiana in 1895. Only a few Southern black elected officials lingered on. No African American was to serve in the U.S. Congress for 3 decades after the departure of George H. White of North Carolina in 1901. The rebirth of white supremacy in the South was accompanied by the growth of enforced racial separation. Starting with Tennessee in 1870, all the Southern states reenacted laws prohibiting interracial marriage. They also passed Jim Crow laws segregating in almost all public places. By 1885 most Southern states had officially segregated their public schools. Moreover, in 1896, in upholding a Louisiana law that required the segregation of passengers on railroad cars, the U.S. Supreme Court in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson established the doctrine of separate but equal. In the post-Reconstruction years, African Americans received only a small share of the increasing number of industrial jobs in Southern cities. And relatively few rural African Americans in the South owned their own farms, most remaining poor sharecroppers heavily in debt to white landlords. The largely urban Northern African American population fared little better. The jobs they sought were given to European immigrants. In search of improvement, many African Americans migrated westward. During and after the Reconstruction period, African Americans in cities organized historical, literary, and musical societies. The literary achievements of African Americans included the historical writings of T. Thomas Fortune and George Washington Williams. The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, 1881, became a classic of autobiography. Black artists also began to make a major impact on American mass culture through the popularity of such groups as the Fisk Jubilee Singers. We love hearing from our viewers, so feel free to leave a comment below sharing your favorite historical period or any topics you'd like us to cover in future videos. Your feedback is invaluable to us as we strive to create content that resonates with our audience. Thank you for tuning in today. Remember, subscribing is the best way to stay connected with us and be part of our history-loving community. Until next time, keep exploring the past and discovering the wonders of history together with us. Subscribe now and embark on an exciting journey through time.